All right, first off, I just got, what's it called? A root canal. And so I could barely think. We got to do this. So let's try. We're on the cusp of a new era, obviously defined by artificial intelligence. If we're not careful, we can really catch ourselves in what's paradoxically a more connected yet more fragmented time in this world. As you know, algorithms put us into tribal think that just push back what we think and what we like. And if we're not careful, the digital world can really reduce us to seeing each other not through the complexity of the human soul, but really truly just as like mere data points. It is in this precise moment of history that we review the life of Saint Maximilian Kolbe. And it is through this movie that I recently watched, Triumph of the Heart, that we get a real sense of who he was. Definitely, I want to share with you some highlights or themes that I noticed throughout the stages of this film that I think can really help us to recognize what structural sin can do to damage our awareness of what's around us, and to focus on how to love universally, right? Even people that I disagree with. Hopefully, these key themes will be something you can discuss, parents especially, with your teenagers as they are trying to navigate this era, which is so confusing. All right, let's begin. The first theme that I want to address is universal love versus the categorized world. St. John Paul II, the previous pontiff, he once shared an important quote. He said, "Humanity is loved by God." And you might think very simply like, well, yeah, no, duh. But it's not that obvious. Like, he's not saying a particular person or a particular group. He's saying all of mankind is loved by God. And do we actually believe that? If we do believe that, then we would be very careful not to see another person as an ally or enemy or someone different, right? And we would not put people into categories, which is really social Marxism. So instead of falling into that trap, we would be able to see and recognize them first as children of God. And that's what happens in the opening scene once the 10 prisoners enter this hunger cell. So after each of the men are called out, once there's this discovery by the SS guards that there is a missing prisoner, 10 men are randomly selected from his bunker and sent to this hunger cell. And once they get there, the guards assume that they will fight to the death within a few days, and they even throw in a rock there for them to do as they wish. But Saint Maximilian, in a very brilliant way, gets very quick to get them acquainted. And as he does, there is this humorous moment where one of the prisoners recognizes, he says, "Wow, after watching several of you introduce yourselves, here we have a Jew, a communist, and a Catholic. Where else would you see this here on earth?" And it was a lighthearted moment in which they could laugh, but there is a truth there. Remember that our dignity is not so much qualified by who we are in the world's eyes of success. We're not, like, again, I say utility, which is totally communist, Marxist, right? So how you succeed in life by your certain natural talents qualifies you for being better than or less than. We realize and recognize that it is purely by our simple existence that we are dignified, right? That it is by God thinking us into being that you and I are loved. How do we live out this understanding of everyone's dignity, that everyone being loved by God is something that we believe and that everyone should believe, right? How do we live that out? And so I thought the movie did a wonderful job of juxtaposing this contagious love from the power of praise. And what I mean by that is you have here two different worlds. Like, you have the secular world and all the glamour that comes with the glory, the fame, the money, the family, and this idealized home, and all the glitz and glamour in that sense, the ideal dream life. And you have the prison cell, right, where the men are ready to die. They're preparing for death. But what's funny is that in this dream life of this SS guard named Carl, you see his family, and their dream life is not a real ideal life. there is this beautiful composition of the camera that goes from the front porch, and you see the kids, and they're kind of playing soccer, but not. And the camera pans into the house where you see the mom waiting at the table, like dressed to the nines, waiting for the family to get together to have this proper meal. And there's no one at the dinner table with her, but you see that all the china is set out, and she's just waiting. But for her, this is her ideal world. And then next to her is another son who's practicing the piano because, that's what brings him interest. And we learn this later because he learns to play the anthem of the Polish people, and that speaks to him, it feeds his heart. And then also we see, on the other hand, the dad, Carl, outside wanting to eat outside. So he's alone too. So you see everyone that's just kind of in their own world. And while from the exterior, this family looks prim, proper, perfect, you see that they're all so isolated, that there is this real loneliness that they're suffering from. Meanwhile, just down the block, you have in this prison cell, this death chamber, you have the prisoners that literally are in the worst place that you could be in the world, yet at the same time, they're united and they're truly alive. Right? That their bond with one another has become so real. And there they are chanting their national anthem. And in it, they are also chanting their praises to the Holy Mother. And this love becomes so contagious because we see that as others, prisoners are walking by and they hear the men singing together, they know that there's no way people can come out of that death chamber. Yet for them to sing together, it defies what's normal, and it's a witness of what's truly supernatural. And so that witness proves that love cannot be stolen no matter how bleak the world appears, and it's just absolutely amazing. That is a real testimony to what we hear in scripture from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 45. You have heard that it is said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And yes, that's exactly what St. Maximilian Kolbe teaches each of the prisoners to do. In fact, he creates what's called the Militia Immaculata, and it's for these men to have a real devotion to Mother Mary and to love others out of devotion to her. And we see that it is through this ultimate contrast that how they live their lives, this Carl officer figure and the men in the prison cell, that towards the end of the movie, you see just the contrast in the final conclusion. So for Officer Carl, we learned that he has a dishonorable discharge. So he was trying so hard to rise in the ranks by getting rid of all these Jews and all the other prisoners, but in the end, it did the adverse, and he ended up having this honorable discharge. Whereas we have this figure, one of the soldiers who was put in prison, Albert, and we hear about his love story. It's this beast story between him and his wife, Margaret, and how the whole time he couldn't stop thinking about how he wanted to go back to her and to receive her praise, right? And we hear that he had an honorable discharge, and we know that because of the way that this other officer presents to her his last note, his death note. And in that note, we hear just how much he was able to change as a man, to do something greater for God's greater glory. And it is actually that praise that I want to tap into a little bit more to understand what that meaning has on Albert's life. And I think this is so good for everyone, especially for teenagers and young adults. They're trying to understand, what is the meaning of life and what am I to strive for? But you see this scene, and it's almost like St. Maximilian and Albert, they can make natural actors, right? They're acting in this movie as actors, right? So it's like acting and acting. But anyway, they both wake up, and it's pretty early in the 2 weeks. I think it's like day 6 or 7. And St. Maximilian says that he wishes he had a cigarette. So Albert responds, kind of surprised. He's like, "You smoke, Father?" And at this point, Albert doesn't have any fondness for him. But you see St. Maximilian trying so hard to win him over as a friend. So he like sits next to him and really kind of engages him. And he says, no, but now will be a good time to start, wouldn't it? And so Albert kind of like, okay, like, yeah, I'll play along. And so he actually like takes out this imaginary cigarette, and starts lighting it. He takes a puff and he hands it over to Father Maximilian. And Father Maximilian enjoys it too. And he says, my father would have killed me if he saw me smoking a cigarette, really. And then, he even coughs, right? He even coughs to play the part. And Albert, they're going through the motions. But now they can get into the meat and potatoes. And Albert asks Father Maximilian what he thinks about his fame, because everyone knew that he was a famous writer and that he has this huge printing press. Father Maximilian said, you know what, it's overrated. And Albert's like, I wouldn't be too quick about that. And he shares about how Albert's goal, his dream in life, was becoming a famous writer. That he also wanted to complete this novel that he's been working on for the longest time. He saw this as like his true summa. And he said, through this novel, had he finished it, he would have gone and his name would have been added to the annals of history, right? That he would have been great like all the greats. There would probably even be a street named after him, like Chopin Street. But what he says after that is ultimately the point. I wanted to win honor and return as a hero, as someone worthy of her, the woman he loves. And that's really what it was. And Father Maximilian responds in that moment. He says, it's good to stand for something. But what's beautiful is that we can hold on to these words and we see through the trajectory of the movie, through the character development, that Albert is really having a conversion of heart. And it is the triumph, not so much of his initial heart, but of his heart being united to the Sacred Heart of Christ. That God's love supersedes everything else, the self-love and all the other loves. And so ultimately, when he dies in the cell, we see at the very end, there is this letter that he wrote in secret, and that letter gets sent over to his loved one, Margaret. And Margaret reads, Dear Margaret, when I was with you, I believed that good always wins, that the happy ending was there for anyone who had faith. But I'm sorry I should have never left you, and I'm not coming back. But I want you to know that somehow in this ugly end, we've triumphed. I believe that you would be proud to see that I became the good man that you always saw in me. I offer my suffering for you and your future children, and I'll see you again someday. Into death and beyond it. Yours, Albert. While glory for him before was about becoming one of these giants, these who's who's, like getting on the front of a Time magazine, he realized that true glory is not so much about the fame and fortune of this world, but to do something radical out of love for another. And for him is truly to do it for the sake of the children that God has entrusted to his care. And this theme, though, of the self-gift, right? The heart that gives of itself, this is ongoing. And that brings us to the next theme of courageous hope and mercy, right? Hope is portrayed in this film throughout. Father Maximilian, he never gave up hope on any of those men in that prison cell. And he really wins them over, not so much by preaching or, telling them otherwise, but really by just mirroring mercy. And so there's one of the most powerful scenes. This is where it's a confession scene. And one of the prisoners, he confesses in front of Father Maximilian and also in front of everybody else. And one of the humors of the scene is that another prisoner named Jonas, he constantly kind of pricks at this moment and as a skeptic, and he says, "What are you guys doing? You guys are wasting your time." St. Maximilian's heart is revealed. And what St. Maximilian does in this moment is so heroic. This prisoner tells Father Maximilian in his confession that he dated a German spy, and she told him that she would protect him if he give up the names of the other Poles that he had with him. Loving her, he gave the list so that he could be with her. And he didn't know the implications, but then realized, that he literally threw his brother Poles into the concentration camps. Knowing that, he couldn't believe what he did, and he's like, how can I be forgiven? But Father Maximilian then reminds him, all things can be forgiven. But then he confesses even further that Father Maximilian Kolbe's name was on that list. That it was because of him that Father Maximilian is in this cell. So this is key, because you can look at the intensity in Father Maximilian's eyes. And Jonas, the other prisoner, the critical one, jumps in and he says, well, isn't this funny? That we're all here, and the joke of it, can't you see? And he starts mimicking Father Maximilian. He says, you want to wave your hand and say a man is forgiven, but all the while you don't admit that you have blackness in your heart. Kolbe, you're just one of us. But in that moment, as to confess, he said, I'm sorry. You could see Father Maximilian looking intently right at him. And then, after a moment, he leans over to him and he says, I forgive you, and I'm sorry. I realize I must confess as well. And this moment is so key. And honestly, if we study this carefully, we can learn exactly how to do the same thing of mirroring mercy. Because after he shares that he needs to confess, Father Maximilian makes this public confession as well. And he shares about how he actually killed one of his brother friars. So the story goes, Father Maximilian's father taught him to be a strong man and to work well. And one day his brother went missing in the war with Russia, and his father went looking for him but never came back. And so St. Maximilian was so angry, and he realized that faith was war for him. And so he went to Japan, and even there he had a really famous printing press. And once one of the brothers fell really sick, instead of allowing him rest, Father Maximilian forced him to keep going, saying that this is God's work and that we must not shy away from it. He was so fatigued that he collapsed and died. And after that, Father Maximilian had a very hard time forgiving himself. And he said that that's why God called him here into the prison cell, this death chamber. He said, it's because of you, to be with you. Then he asks, will you forgive me? And in that moment, the prisoners, they all rise up and they say, I forgive you, Father. And Freddie steps in and says, Father, there's not any other man I'd rather be next to in the end. So there is this is, capturing the power of that mercy. Now, I think as a parent, by the way, anytime you have a child who's not willing to come to church, well, they have yet to really know God. It is this kind of example, or they have this encounter of God's mercy that helps them to realize how grateful we should be. And that should spur them to wanting to come to church, because it's not mom or dad said so. No, it's like, wow, I know the sins I've committed. And when I'm willing to be vulnerable, God's able to help me to see how God is forgiving. As ashamed as I am, the fact that God's forgiving me for that, like I don't deserve to receive anything, but I'm all His, right? So there is this triumph of the heart. And that scene teaches us the power of vulnerability and how that causes love. That experience allows people to rise above what's natural, beyond themselves, and to really become heroes. And that's how Albert was able to become a true hero for the sake of Margaret and for that family. Throughout the movie, we also see, and I want to conclude with this, the Black Madonna, also known as Our Lady of Czestochowa. This is very beautifully portrayed because Saint Maximilian, being a Polish man, obviously had a devotion to Our Lady Czestochowa. But we see through that image these scars, particularly 2 scars on Mother Mary's face. And that's iconic because the icon was damaged. This is like centuries ago, back in 1430. There was these Hussite raiders who attacked. They put the image on one of their carriages and it fell over. One of them started slashing away at it. After 2 slashes, coming the third, he actually was killed. Many people tried to repair this image, but couldn't because the scars would remain. But there is this beautiful witness to the power of love and an accompaniment. And Our Lady of Czestochowa, who teaches us that when her children suffer, she accompanies them to the very end. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've done, and we all have things that we regret. But as St. Maximilian showed the men in the cell, it's truly that salvation, which is all that matters. Whether they are beginning by themselves or whether they are completely committed to loving the others, it is that conversion, one soul at a time. And St. Maximilian Kolbe reminds us very famously, he says, conversion of the world begins with oneself. Whoever, like to imagine, like, for example, I'm Korean, I'm Catholic, and it's easy for me to connect with anyone who's Korean Catholic. But if I think of all these other people in my surroundings that I don't know very well or that I have a hard time connecting with, like, how well do I try to love them, to really consider that person as a fellow brother or sister? And it's something that I think we all have to work on till our last breath. But it's definitely a goal that God has called us to. Well, thank you for joining me for this review. I hope that it was helpful. Gabby After Hours is an amazing channel, and Gabby puts out some amazing videos. He also has a great documentary on St. Maximilian. Really good production. I highly encourage anyone who's interested in more background on this saint to check out that video. All right, well, that's it for today. I'll see you next time.